all at the same time. Even without a war with Iran, which, by the way, is looking increasingly likely with each passing day, it definitely appears that the US economy is steamrolling toward recession territory. The employment numbers for last month were abysmal. Global trade has collapsed to the lowest level we've seen since the last recession, and manufacturing numbers just keep getting worse and worse. In fact, the New York Fed's Empire State Manufacturing Index just suffered the worst one-month decline in history. The New York Fed's Empire State Business Conditions Index took a sharp turn for the worse in June, falling into negative territory for the first time in more than 2 years. The Empire State Manufacturing Index plummeted 26.4 points to negative 8.6 in June, the New York Fed said Monday. That's a record decline. Economists had expected a reading of positive 10, according to a survey by Econoday. Not even during the last recession did we witness a plunge of that magnitude. But before we begin these economic collapse news, we would like to thank our sponsors, Vikings War of Clans. The dev team there inspired will be extremely useful in crisis. And other measures of U.S. manufacturing activity are also sinking steadily. And it's not the only indicator showing a turn for the worse. Others, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Manufacturing Business Outlook Survey, have also been sinking steadily. Manufacturers are sensitive not just to the actual imposition of tariffs, but also to the threat of new tariffs. That fear has escalated in recent weeks as President Donald Trump continued to hold open the possibility of 10% duties on an additional $300 billion worth of goods from China, even as he backed off on the idea of taxing Mexican imports as leverage in his campaign for more restrictions on cross-border migration. When you step back and look at the big picture, it becomes quite clear what is happening. At this point, it is simply not possible for anyone to credibly claim that the U.S. economy is still in good shape. As a reminder, last Sunday we reported that the Morgan Stanley Business Conditions Index just suffered its biggest one-month drop in history. Predictably, this was sufficient ammo for Morgan Stanley's chief U.S. equity strategist, Michael Wilson, to launch on what may be his most bearish tirade so far this year. And as the strategist writes, data points and analyst sentiment are falling, and we think PMIs and earnings revisions are next. That's just a beginning. Decelerations and disappointments are mounting. Cass Freight Index, retailer earnings, durable goods orders, capital spending, PMIs, May payrolls, semiconductor inventories, oil demand, restaurant performance indices, and our own Morgan Stanley Business Conditions Index, MSBCI. Looking at the MSBCI in particular, the headline metric showed the biggest one-month drop in its history, going back to 2002 and very close to its lowest absolute reading since December 2008. This index has a tight relationship with ISM new orders and analyst earnings revisions breadth. Our analysis shows downside risk to ISM new orders, 25% year-on-year. S&P earnings revisions breadth 6 to 13%, and the S&P 500 year-on-year 8% if historical links hold. Now, while we showed the MSBCI last week, here it is again in the context of PMI headline and new orders. As Wilson warns, be prepared for a sharp fall in PMIs. As the MSBCI suggests, the manufacturing PMI new orders component will fall to 40 over the next few months, which would be down approximately 25% on a year-on-year basis. Another way of putting it, if Morgan Stanley's indicator is right, the world is already in a recession. As Wilson explains, the reason he takes this MSBCI so seriously is due to the very tight relationship it has with the ISM, Manufacturing Purchasing Manager Index, and new orders shown above, and the ISM's relationship with year-on-year changes in the S&P. Speaking of the latter, Morgan Stanley cautions that based on the historical relationship between the year-on-year change in the manufacturing PMI new orders and S&P 500, we now expect a fall of approximately 10% for the major indices, with wide dispersion between stocks and sectors. Now, many analysts are pointing out that our economic problems really seem to start accelerating once trade negotiations with China completely broke down, and this is true. If the US and China could find a way to reach a trade agreement, that would be a tremendous short-term boost to the economy at a time when we desperately need it. But that isn't going to happen unless President Trump completely caves in. Because at this point, the Chinese are extremely angry. They are in definitely no mood to compromise. In fact, one Chinese editorial that was recently published boldly declared that they are ready to fight it out till the end. China will not be afraid of any threats or pressure the United States is making that may escalate economic and trade frictions. China has no choice nor an escape route and will just have to fight it out till the end. The Kushi commentary said, "No one, no force should underestimate and belittle the steel will of the Chinese people and its strength and tenacity to fight a war." When Americans are deeply suffering during the next recession, will they be willing to fight it out till the end like the Chinese are? And if a trade war with China wasn't enough, now we have a trade war with India to deal with. In fact, India just hit US exports with a wave of very large tariffs. The tariffs on several US products will go into effect on June 16th, India's finance ministry said in a statement Saturday. The goods targeted include American apples, which will be hit with a 70% tariff, as well as almonds, lentils, and several chemical products. India first announced plans to impose new tariffs a year ago in retaliation for increased US import duties on Indian steel and aluminum. But it repeatedly delayed imposing them while the two sides held a series of trade talks. Of course, these tariffs were in retaliation for the tariffs that we hit India with after Trump kicked them out of a preferential trade program. The two countries exchange goods and services worth about $142 billion a year, but the relationship has soured in recent weeks after the Trump administration ended India's participation in a preferential trade program earlier this month. The program exempted Indian goods worth more than $6 billion from U.S. import duties in 2018. We were certainly heading for a recession, even without these trade conflicts, but without a doubt they have made things substantially worse. And now is definitely not a good time for a recession, because much of the country is completely and utterly unprepared for any sort of an economic downturn. The following comes from an opinion piece authored by William Spriggs. One oft-cited statistic points to just how unstable the finances of most Americans are. Nearly 40% of households could not withstand an unexpected expenditure of $400, the cost of just one medical bill or car repair. The most unnerving point to keep in mind is that we are even less prepared for a sudden slowing of the economy than we were before the Great Recession of 2008. During the relatively stable economic times of the past few years, Americans should have been preparing instead of partying. But instead, most Americans bought into the myth that our massively bloated, debt-fueled standard of living could be perpetuated indefinitely. So, now a crisis is coming which many believe is going to be even worse than what we experienced in 2008, and most of us are going to be completely blindsided by it.